Hello, ladies and gentlemen! Recently I released a Pilaf episode where I hyperbolically picked on Rainbow Dash and I made some fans rather angry. They felt I was unfair and that I do not understand the show, and that I want a bunch of changes that are silly and don't make a lot of sense. So, I thought I'd do a show where I actually just kind of put my thoughts out there, piece by piece, as to what I think of the writing of the show in an actual serious analysis. And this is funny because I've sort of made fun of, I've used Pilaf to make fun of the whole analysis community, the analysis idea. But the reason why I did that was because the analysis community, they're kind of in a box where they can talk about My Little Pony, but they still have to be sort of reverent of it these days. They're kind of trapped. They say, this is what I liked about this episode, and I'm really looking forward to the next one. They can't really do real analysis. They'd lose all their fans. Now, of course, that doesn't make analysis inherently silly. There's a lot of different things you can look at. My Little Pony uses some interesting techniques. Sometimes, like with backgrounds, for example, they have some neat ways that they set up their backgrounds, so you can talk about their animation and their process. And you can also talk about their writing and kind of where they started and where they've gotten to. Now, although you can talk about their process, their writing process, it's important to point out, first of all, that My Little Pony is written essentially by freelancers. They don't have a consistent staff, so when you see names like M.A. Larson and Amy Keating and whatever, they're not like people hired to be on My Little Pony full-time. What they do is they write a script as freelancers, and then they get paid as freelancers, and there's not really this sort of unified approach to the show. That means that as the show has gone on from season to season, we've had executive producers come and go, we've had directors change, we've had new writers come in, so you're getting these different visions for the show and different approaches to the characters, so things are just going to change, and some people really like to insist that nothing is different, like all we've done is we've built up from point A to point B, but definitely we've had some different perspectives as time has gone on. That also means that anyone on the internet, I feel like, trying to influence the show is wasting their time. Like, Pilaf has never been like a serious pitch to the show to say like, hey, this is how you need to change. Same goes with any of the parodies that I've done. The fun that I poke is just fun that I poke, and I recognize that I would be really shocked if someone high enough on the staff was like, oh, we should really take this guy's opinions. So when I see people getting mad about like, oh, Greg's trying to influence the show, I don't think that could work, and the point is really just to entertain my own audience, which has overlap with the My Little Pony audience because they're My Little Pony parodies, but basically the idea is to entertain people who watch my stuff. Specifically the adult fans, and hence we will lead into this analysis and why, as an adult fan, the show has sort of lost me, or it's drifted away from what I want to do. The point is not to be morose, but anyway, I'm just going to go by and I want to talk about point by point stuff that I've observed about the show. And the first thing I want to talk about is Luna, because Luna was really interesting. Back in the beginning years of the fandom, Luna was like one of the most popular characters, and it was because we knew the very least about her. She showed up in the very first episode, and she was this tiny little pony. She was the tiny little princess pony, little sister of Princess Celestia, and kind of the butt of a lot of jokes because she got sent away to the moon for 1,000 years, which is really comical. Like when the big sister sends the little sister away to the moon for 1,000 years. It just sounds like something like siblings would do to each other, and everyone had this great laugh about it. And in her first appearance, she looked really little and really demure, and everyone had this idea of how they wanted her to be. Number one most popular pony in the fandom back then. But in season 2, they finally introduced her, for real, gave her her own episode, and she was nothing like she appeared in the first season. Now, by itself, there's nothing wrong with that, and that's kind of what keeps happening with My Little Pony. I keep finding myself saying, like, by itself, there's nothing wrong with this. But by itself, there's nothing wrong with Luna not being how the fans expected. She wound up being loud, she wound up being tall, she was bigger than all the other ponies, she was kind of dumb, and she gave a very opposite impression than what she started out with. So everyone with their fanfics and everything like that, suddenly Luna was really out of character, because she wasn't like shy and cute and stuff like that, she was just really loud. So anyway though, like I say, not a problem on its own, it wiped out a lot of fanfics, but we got characterizations that were still fun using that sort of thing. The proper show didn't really depict her on screen, again, for quite a while, but then we got, like, IDW comics that depicted Luna as being neurotic and fun and interesting and kind of a sharp juxtaposition from her sister. Celestia was very calm, very stoic, and then Luna was just kind of wild and didn't really have her act together. She was a little bit disorganized, and so people really loved her depiction in the comic. And had we seen that in the canon, I think that she would have grown on everyone again, and she would have reclaimed her space as favorite pony. But we didn't, and I can only speculate as to why that is. But what really happened was that Luna continued to make appearances, and she also wound up just being very stoic and not very expressive. She's very ordered, and more often than not, she was actually creating problems. I got kind of a laugh, and this is one reason why we depicted Luna as being dangerous and psychotic, was because as she was showing up, she was doing things like creating the Tantabus and what have you, which were like legitimate threats to the world, and proof that maybe Luna should have just stayed on the moon. And when she wasn't really an antagonist, she kind of was just dropping exposition. She would show up and be like, yes, hello, let me sum up the lesson that you've learned, or let me tell you the source of the conflict today. So very dull, very boring. And all I have is a theory as to why this wound up. I think that maybe they were kind of looking at the princess thing and they were saying to themselves, well, being a princess is a big deal, and we need to be kind of aloof and a little bit mysterious about the powers the princesses have and how this all works. So Luna, instead of just being crazy and grounded, she wound up being like Celestia, where we got to see less personality out of her, and they were hoping that maybe that would make the princess thing seem bigger and more intimidating. I don't know if that was the logic, but I can see why that would be justification to depict Luna the way that they did. The trouble with that, then, is that now we get into Celestia, where originally in Season 1 and most of Season 2, Celestia was very aloof. She would show up, but she always had this kind of regal air to her, and we didn't know how strong she was, so there was a lot of jokes about, like, Tyrant Celestia, and this and that, where people assumed that she was this puppet master. Lauren Faust even suggested that Celestia had some, maybe, clairvoyance. But she didn't want to define exactly how strong Celestia was because the mystery was important. The problem, though, is that as we went on from season to season to season, Celestia kept being set up to fail, so that story-wise, Twilight Sparkle would have this context of like, okay, well, you need to go and solve the problem because the biggest, strongest pony in the world can't do it. TV Tropes calls this dwarfing, because there was a similar thing that happened in Star Trek. There was this character named Worf who was like the security officer. He was the biggest, baddest badass on the entire ship. And so every time they had a villain and they wanted to establish how dangerous the villain was, that villain would beat up Worf. So the audience would say like, oh no, they beat up Worf. This is a very strong villain. But the problem was that as Worf kept getting beaten up, eventually audiences realized that Worf had never won a fight in his life, and maybe he wasn't really all that much of a badass. So Celestia's been the same way, where like every time some villain shows up, the first thing that villain does is defeat Celestia, so that the kids will be like, oh no, like what a powerful villain. But by season 7, you realize that Celestia has not won even once. And while back in season 1, I would have looked at Celestia and said like, oh, she's like a god, she's as powerful as a god. By season 7, I say to myself like, well, Celestia's probably barely more powerful than the average unicorn. Sometimes I think that maybe she might even be weaker than the average unicorn. And the only standout thing about her is that she can move the sun. Not only that, but we see Celestia creating plans that are destined to fail from time to time so that Twilight can solve the problem. And she continuously bets on Twilight. She just gambles everything on these like one-off Deus Ex Machinas. And she's proven correct because the Deus Ex Machinas work, but it's not really very good leadership and not really very good planning. And so kids probably miss out on this, but as an adult, I watch Celestia make her master plans, and I think to myself like, this is a very dumb horse. Like this is not a good way to organize your future. Now, granted, we were never going to get this sort of mastermind thing going on because as a kid's show, kids were not going to be able to wrap their heads around like Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty style suspense or anything like that. But just over time, she's been gradually, in my mind, she's shifted down to just this like big, stupid white horse that doesn't do anything. Now, I feel like that would have happened gradually anyway, but what really did her a lot of damage was Twilight Sparkle. Twilight Sparkle had to become a princess. We all know this was a big toy thing. Hasbro came in and they said, you know what, just make this happen. And again, this is one of these things, I feel like it's really awkward and it's really unfair because the show doesn't have a built-in staff. And if they had a built-in staff, if they had just a team of writers who were on hire for this show, maybe they could have made Princess Twilight Sparkle work. But it's like this huge left turn, and I feel like after Twilight became a princess, there's like an entire season, like all of season 4, they don't really seem to own the fact that Twilight is a princess. They don't refer to her as the princess of anything in any of the scripts. It's not until season 5 that they start saying like, oh yes, the princess of friendship. They talk about it a little bit, but it's, like I say, it seems like they're not sure what to do with it, and it's just very clumsy and awkward. Which makes sense, again, if you come back to the idea of the writers being freelance. Because it's sort of like, okay, so Twilight's a princess now, and the writers are like, oh, well, what's going on with that? And whoever's, the other show staff are like, well, we don't know yet, so just write your episodes and we'll figure it out. There's some noticeable upset, in my opinion, revolving around the entire thing. And of course, it was also one of the biggest, moments of frustration from the fandom. We had on 4chan, Moot was playing, sad music, and he had a sticky, it was like, where is your god now? But anyway, let's get into the subject of the writing and how profoundly this really kind of messed up the writing. The thing is that when the show started out, Twilight was kind of our audience surrogate. She was the fish out of water. She was this character. She came from Canterlot, but they moved her down into Ponyville. And so she was unfamiliar with Ponyville, and so was the audience. Which meant that whenever something happened in Ponyville, Twilight would ask questions for the audience so that we'd all become acquainted together with how things worked. And if something was weird or out of place, Twilight would comment on it so that we knew that in this magical world, it was strange to use leeches for medicine or something, any kind of weird thing they said. Twilight would establish that it was weird. Because some magic is totally commonplace and some magic is not. But once she became a princess, she kind of lost that element. It became like, well, you're our leader now, so you can't go around being ignorant and demanding to know what everything is. Or you could, but it would come across as just being really upsetting. People don't like to see that from a leadership position. They expect that their leader is informed, that there's somebody there who tells them what's going on. They have advisors, right? But My Little Pony doesn't have advisors. They don't get into that kind of stuff. The comics did, but the comics targeted a slightly older audience. The show never really does get into advisors, or how the princesses are to obtain their information. Twilight, to this day, still essentially lives in her castle all by herself. So, aside from losing our audience surrogate, our fish out of water who explained the universe to us, we also had to look more at what the princess thing really was. Because now that the main character is a princess, you can't hide that job anymore. And unfortunately, again, the writers, because they'd never really established well what the princesses were doing, because they tried to be aloof and mysterious, when Twilight became a princess and they had to just sit there and say alright, this is what a princess does, they had nothing. So Twilight kind of wound up doing nothing, and she made it clear that the princesses maybe don't necessarily do anything. Cadence maybe doesn't really do anything, Luna, Celestia, they just don't do anything. So all that subtext, which again mainly would just appeal to adults really, kind of got wiped out and erased. Now, what could they have done to make that work better? I think that when it happened, I wasn't really sure how exactly I would have tackled the problem, but years later, with all the advantage of hindsight, I can look back and I think maybe one possibility, and there's not just one possibility, there's a couple of different ways that you could handle things, but one possibility would be, what if they kept Twilight as the fish out of water, but now she's a fish out of water to this sort of royal high society? So every episode with Twilight in it would be about the princess has to come do this thing, and Twilight would say well, what's all this about then? And she would travel around the world, and they'd say yeah, there's your ceremonial duty in this part of the world, where you have to do the annual cutting of the ribbons or whatever. And so then you'd have kind of a lot of jobs the princess would have to do, and you could build a lot of episodes and a lot of conflict around Twilight's new responsibilities, with Twilight constantly asking what the big deal was, and an advisor sent to her maybe by Celestia, showing some wisdom for once, telling her the answers to all these questions. So that way she's not just barging in and being what's all this then? And they'd be don't you know already? It's a new dynamic, which is risky, because you don't know if that new dynamic is going to work out and if audiences are going to like it. But truth be told, they eventually got out of Ponyville anyway, because they had the magic table spring up, and then they had the magic table send them all over the world. So it's not like they didn't just inevitably start getting out of Ponyville as it was. But again, advantage of hindsight, I don't know what kind of chaos was created by this internal decision in the first place. It may have taken a really long time for anyone to get their finger on top of what was happening. But speaking of getting out of Ponyville, the trouble was that, again, they really hadn't defined very well what was outside of Ponyville, and as they started to do episodes where they were looking at Manhattan and this and that, they were doing so now some point kind of later in. We were looking at season 4, season 5, and they were going out to places and finding that ponies were actually past the Industrial Revolution. Based on Ponyville, you wouldn't have expected this, but I know in Season 4 there was some complaints because they went to, like, this little Greasy Spoon restaurant, and there was, like, wrapping paper and, like, branding on the food. And nowadays, like, by this point in the show, if you brought this up and you're like, hey, this is really weird, you get the fans defending it, and they're like, oh, no, like, look at all these other examples of more advanced technology. Like, we've got a rave room, you know? Technology is clearly far enough advanced. We're in, I don't know, the 1960s at this point with the ponies. But before that, we really hadn't seen any kind of high technology. We hadn't seen any examples of, like, a printing press, necessarily, or just, like, the type of industrial corporate branding that you see in the modern era. In fact, that kind of stuff was a little bit antithetical to the original themes of the show. What they originally did was sort of a traditional romantic perspective, where they were very much in touch with nature. The ponies, you know, helped the animals wake up for the springtime. They flew the birds north and south, and if a pony made a mistake, they could fly the birds in the wrong directions. Everything was very much about being at one with nature. So it's kind of weird, and it was a little bit jarring to suddenly start seeing the ponies living in skyscrapers and having all the roads be paved, and, you know, there's no animals in sight in any of these cities. Which leads into the question of, how does that work? That seems incredibly selfish of the ponies. Humans conquered nature. We built cities to say, like, this is our space. Dangerous animals, get out. But ponies have to actually wake the animals up from spring, and if you just pave over all the rabbit burrows and you build giant skyscrapers on top of all the forests, well, what are the animals doing? Like, they're helpless without ponies. They established in the early seasons that the Everfree Forest was the only place where animals took care of themselves. So they kind of erased a lot of that when they started getting into the cities. All those old themes and everything like that. And not only that, but as they started to explore these cities and show, like, well, here's Lost Pegasus, you know, with other arcades and this and that, we stopped asking the question of, like, well, you know, what's out there? You know, there's all this big scary world with all these things that eat these ponies, these dragons and manticores and so on. And it got to be like, well, there's nothing out there. The ponies have tamed Equestria. It's a very safe place. You know, we're in the industrial, like, we're post-industrial. The ponies don't really have to look after the animals, but in some rural villages, they take pity on them and don't leave them out to die, I guess. I don't know. My impression is that over time, the show just kind of began to forget itself. And not only was it forgetting itself, but it started to really forget its characters. For example, we get into Fluttershy, and a lot of people I've seen, they're like, oh, if Greg doesn't like character development, I bet he hates Fluttershy because she's assertive now. And that's got to be one of the silliest comments that I see sometimes. One thing that happened is we had Fluttershy did an entire episode where she tried to hire other ponies to make a nature preserve. And if you remember back in Season 1, like I say, ponies used to wake up the animals from spring. They controlled the animals. This episode went to show that whoever's involved with the show at this point maybe doesn't really remember anymore all those old romantic themes. It's been so long that they've just forgotten. Because in theory, every pony on Earth should know how to take care of animals. Like, they really wouldn't make cages for them. Like, you have to wake up the snakes, you have to wake up the squirrels, you have to help the birds fly north and south. How could you not know what the animals need for basic survival? And not only that, but Fluttershy went from this caretaker, like, I used to kind of joke, like, oh, there's a vet and Fluttershy's taking care of animals because she craves love. But then the show just kind of turned around and they were like, oh, well, there's a vet, and Fluttershy is just taking care of the animals because she craves love. And I did it because it was funny, but when the show does it, it's actually kind of sad for Fluttershy. So yeah, 7 years later, we learn that Fluttershy actually doesn't heal the sick animals, she just gives them a place to crash after they see the vet. And otherwise, she gives a strong recommendation to the local vet. But aside from, like, people say, oh, well, she's assertive now, Greg, I bet Greg hates how assertive she is now. I think that that's kind of ludicrous, because if you really examine what Fluttershy has become in the show, she's not more assertive. She just kind of talks more. She dumps exposition more often, and it's not really a good use of the character. Fluttershy, I think, was always tough to write, or I suspect that she was always tough to write, because she's so quiet and she's kind of out of the way. You have to work a lot more around her or create situations that demonstrate what she's thinking in an episode about Fluttershy. It makes her a challenge. So when they sort of forget who the character is and they kind of move away from what Fluttershy was about, instead they just get into, like, well, I'm shy, but now I'm assertive, and I hire you people to do this thing, and then, you don't do it, so I just fire you, and, I'm assertive. There's not really a lot of personality there. Look at Fluttershy where she is in Season 7 right now, and then just describe to me who Fluttershy is as a person. Don't tell me what she does, it's that kind of joke. Like, without telling me what the character looks like or what she does, describe Fluttershy to me. And don't say, like, oh, she's the shy one, because she's also supposed to be the assertive shy one now, so how is she this sort of oxymoronic thing? And I see people get weird because they say, well, the character needed to develop, we can't just have episode after episode about Fluttershy being shy. And yeah, it would get dull to do the same episodes over and over again. But she's not really, there's no reason that she should be compelled to go from being the shy one to being the assertive one. Because in real life, people don't necessarily have total personality changes. You might sort of learn to forget bad habits. But forgetting a habit is a building process. You have to work to replace one habit with kind of new habits. And it takes months of hard work to do that sort of thing. Like a lot of shy people know that being shy is kind of a problem. You don't just one day teach them a life lesson, be like, oh, Dave, being shy is bad. And then they say, you know what, you're right, I'm going to stop being shy. Like, for them to get over that shyness, they have to constantly expose themselves to other people and just, it's a coping mechanism, and they have to work past that coping mechanism and develop new systems for social interaction. So, again, you could do that, but it would be kind of this very long thing. You'd need multiple episodes. It would be like an arc. And when your writing staff is entirely freelance, it's pretty unlikely that you would cobble all that together in a cohesive way. The format and structure of the show and how it's written just doesn't work with that sort of development too well. And the thing is that people get confused and they start to think about the characters as though they were real. And they say Fluttershy has to make some progress in life, Fluttershy has to do something. But she's a fictional character. I really don't care if Fluttershy succeeds at things. I really don't care if Fluttershy actually, if she opens a haircutting salon or something like that. It doesn't really matter to me whether or not Fluttershy is making ends meet, because she's not real. What does matter to me is whether or not the character has stuff to do, and whether or not you can use her to tell a story, or, whether she's really intriguing her audiences. Which then brings us to Rainbow Dash, which a lot of people were angry about the last peel-off, because I talked about, I made a lot of jokes about how dumb Dash was. And Dash is funny because Dash, she's the most convenient antagonist who's also a protagonist. There's not really a lot of villains in My Little Pony. They keep reforming all their villains. And this would be a good segue into Discord, but we'll keep going with Dash for right now. Anyway, point is, Rainbow Dash, she sometimes comes across as kind of stupid. She sometimes comes across as kind of clever. She has different characterizations that sort of fit the script. So she's not always consistent, but she's good for that because she's very impulsive. The thing, though, is that now she's a Wonderbolt, and they've been really weird with the way that they handled her whole Wonderbolt thing. Again, we come back to the fact that Dash is a fictional character. All fiction is a lie. It really doesn't matter too much what you say about her. I don't care if Dash becomes a Wonderbolt. I don't care if she gives up on her dream and she becomes like a cashier like Pinkie Pie. The important thing is just that you have a story to tell and somewhere to go with this character, and that she remains coherent. But with the Wonderbolt thing, it was always her big dream. And then they did the episode where they were like, well, Dash has this alternative learning method. And the moral alone wasn't bad. Some people were kind of like, well, that Amy Keating, she has a son with special needs, and this is kind of an important message, probably from her perspective. And that's fine, but it was also, from a strictly storytelling perspective, it was kind of a shark jumping moment for the show. Because you establish, Dash learns through the periphery of her vision, and she somehow memorizes things perfectly as long as she sees it in her periphery, which is, it's a sort of a savant type of thing. It's not really a way that people actually learn. It's not really, even if you had special needs, you wouldn't learn that way unless you were one of the very, very, very lucky few with those kinds of mental superpowers. And then, after establishing that Dash passed her exams and got into the Wonderbolts, well, she was in the Wonderbolts, so they jumped a shark there. They'd taken it to where, if you're not familiar with the term jumping a shark, the show Happy Days used to be really popular, but then as ratings started to fall, they thought, well, we need to shake things up and make some changes to bring the audience back in. So they took the Happy Days cast and they put them in Hawaii, and they had Fonzie jump a shark to say, there, things are changing. So Dash becoming a Wonderbolt, we went from Dash having this ambition of I'm going to be a Wonderbolt, and then we shook things up and we had this change, and now Dash is a Wonderbolt, so we jumped a shark there. And jumping a shark is not necessarily bad, but the trouble is that because, again, we come back to this situation where we have all the writers are freelance and there's not necessarily this clear vision that everyone is following together. Once Dash got into the Wonderbolts, we had to wait for a little while, and then next season they had to figure out, like, okay, well, what do we do now that Dash is a Wonderbolt? And there's kind of two problems here. The first is that being in the Wonderbolts should theoretically be a really big deal. Like, it's a sports thing. It's like if you got into the NFL or the NBA, for you to be in there, you would be practicing, sunrise to sundown. But Dash still needs to go on her little adventures, so somehow we need to have Dash be in this major thing and then also have time to do everything else. The same can really be said of Applejack's farm. Like, Applejack needs to tend to her farm, but we kind of sweep that under the rug because we started the whole show with Applejack on her farm, and most of the time we were in Ponyville. So we got away with it. And maybe if Dash had been in the Wonderbolts when the show started, it would have been fine. But because it was this big thing for her, for so many seasons, for so many years, when she gets it, it seems a little inappropriate to then just kind of brush the Wonderbolts under the rug and say, like, well, it's really not that big of a deal. Rainbow Dash is still in Ponyville 90% of the time. When you look at it like that, when you find that you have to just kind of ignore the Wonderbolts after Dash gets into it to continue to have your show function in the same format, the same adventure a day kind of thing, you start to wonder, like, why, as a writer, would you do this with the character? Why would you try to cram her into her? Why would you come to the end of her ambition, have her succeed at her ambition, and then just be like, well, now occasionally we'll just be with the Wonderbolts? But the problem was, too, then, now when we have episodes with Dash and the Wonderbolts, we try to have conflict there, and they've been using the Wonderbolts to make conflict, or Dash's relationship with the Wonderbolts to make conflict. So very early on, like with Newbie Dash, they established that Dash is not emotionally mature enough to be in the Wonderbolts, and it just really made the whole thing feel kind of disgusting, in my opinion. So my impression with this Wonderbolts thing is that they did it, and it was similar to the Twilight Princess thing, where there was kind of no plan, and maybe not everyone was on the same page with this idea. They didn't know specifically where they were going to go with it, they just decided to go ahead and do it. And then, of course, there's Rarity with a lot of very similar problems, where they just kind of achieved her life ambition, and so she opened this boutique in Canterlot, and then, that really didn't amount to anything, so then they opened another boutique in Manhattan, and they could just kind of do that, until the audience just barfs, because they're sick of it. Like, as long as there's no conflict, as long as you continually sweep the life ambition under the rug so that you can have your adventure a day, you could go on just opening an infinite number of boutiques and it would never matter because you're always just sweeping the responsibility under the rug. And it's weird because if you try to create like some grounding for this, you'd have to say like, okay, so what Rarity is doing is she's franchising, essentially. But how is she controlling this franchise? Like, is she at the head somehow? How is she communicating? Is she sending letters? There's a lot of questions you could ask, and there's a lot of story that you could write. But like, the minutia of running a business is over the heads of children. So you come back to this question of like, well, you can't really do anything with this. You have some interesting stuff. I mean, like Saddle Row Review was a fun episode and I really enjoyed it. But from a writing perspective, there's no long-term value here, and it kind of creates more problems, and it doesn't really fit with your show format. From a writing perspective, I don't care what the characters, like whether or not they succeed in life. What I care about is whether or not you can still do stuff with them. And while this doesn't necessarily have to close doors, the subject of running a business or the subject of being committed to this like high-octane sports career, they're both kind of more adult sort of things, and I see it being a really huge challenge in a kids show, and I just don't get why they would have done that. Like, it's not necessarily that they couldn't do anything with it, and I'm sure that they'll do occasional episodes that are good and make use of the premise, but most of the time, I think the overwhelming majority of the time, they're going to be sweeping the whole concept under the rug so that they can stick to the format that's been working for them. So anyway, there's that, and finally, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the villains. We also have kind of this weirdness with Discord is the most standout thing, where they've been reforming villains, and like John Delancey is still great. Like, I love, it seems like even if they have a bad script, John Delancey has fun, and maybe he doesn't even stay on script. Like, just love the way that he does that character. I really like Discord when he shows up, but I think it was a really awful idea to reform him, because again, you create all these problems. Like, I see people asking, like, oh, well, where was Discord in the My Little Pony movie? And the answer is, not there, because he wasn't ruining the movie. If Discord had shown up and been like, hey everybody, I'm Discord here, I can solve all these problems with the snap of my fingers, then they have to do one of two things. Either he has to betray the ponies, which he did with the whole Tyrek episode, or they have to take his powers away, which they've done every other time that they wanted Discord to be involved and not solve all the problems instantaneously. In fact, ultimately in the show, more often than not, they still use him as a soft antagonist. Mostly he shows up just to make Twilight miserable, and I think that that's probably the best way that they could use a character who they insist is reformed. But then, of course, the fact is that Discord's not really reformed, he's just being good so they don't turn him into a statue again, I guess. But after Discord, I suppose that maybe we've always reformed villains. If you think about Nightmare Moon, we never really reformed the Diamond Dogs, but it would be really nice if we just went back to, like, I don't know, small manageable villains like the Diamond Dogs, or it would have been probably the way to go, and then just not reform them all the time. Because, in some cases, it really doesn't make any sense, like the Changelings suddenly being like, oh, actually, we never had to eat love. Which was just weird, because it's like, well, why did you eat love in the first place? Like, what compelled you to do that? And then people were like, well, Chrysalis is evil, she said that they had to eat love. Or but then why did Chrysalis eat love? Because Chrysalis would just be objectively stronger if she became a friend to everyone, and then she could do whatever she wanted to do, but from the strength of having friends. So sometimes the reformations are stupid, and I don't know why they did it. Like, well, now that you just don't have this entire faction of villains anymore, now they're all friends. Like, you befriended the dragons, you're just making friends of everybody. Like, pretty soon, I almost kind of want to hear that they befriended the Diamond Dogs, and now the Diamond Dogs are friends with all the ponies, and there is no conflict in Ponyville whatsoever, except for when Rainbow Dash decides she's gonna be a piece of garbage. Because that's one of the few antagonists. Like, the writers kind of look around, they're like, well, who's going to be the antagonist today? Rainbow Dash is. It's not entirely terrible for a show, again, from the creation perspective, to have villains. We can get a little break from our heroes being the villains from time to time, because we have people more evil than them out there. But anyway, though, at the bottom line, at the end of the day, the trouble is that, like I say, all fiction is a lie. I really don't care about where the characters, or whether or not the characters are succeeding in life. Like, I don't care about whether or not Twilight Sparkle is in royalty or if she's in poverty. What I care about is whether or not I can believe the lies. Are the lies straight? Is this convincing? Do I care about what's going to happen next? And I really no longer care about what's going to happen next to these characters, because I don't believe the story that's being told to me. I don't really care what's happening in the universe, because from what I've seen, it doesn't really look like there's very much in that universe. It's just kind of like Ponyville's conquered. There's nothing really going on in Ponyville. And everything is weaker than the ponies, so I'm really not, at any stage of suspense where I'm like, oh, what big terrible thing might come out from the corners of the known world. Nothing is stronger than the ponies. Nothing's gonna really hurt them. Twilight Sparkle is God Princess, Rainbow Dash, fastest pony ever, Wonderbolts, Fluttershy, she's assertive now, Applejack farms apples, Pinkie Pie, Spinkie Pie, Rarity owns all the money. She just pulls it out of thin air. Money doesn't even mean anything to her because it's totally fictional, and the writers will just brush all of her expenses under the rug. Like, what is stronger than that? Like, what's gonna come out of the world, like, and threaten them? Nothing. There's no suspense. I just don't care. And people think that you have to be bitter and sad to come to this perspective, and I don't feel like you do. There's a lot of people who you just don't hear from anymore, because they weren't, like, making a lot of stuff for the fandom. They were just fans who lost interest in the show because they quit believing the lies. They quit caring about what was happening anymore. They saw that, Dash became a Wonderbolt, and then they kind of quit watching after that because it was like, yeah, it's done. I don't really want to watch it anymore. I don't want to see them show me what happens after she's a Wonderbolt. I kind of want to maintain this mental image. Twilight became a princess. Some people quit in season 3, some in season 4. People just walk away from the show because they lose interest in it. And the thing that was frustrating for me wasn't really that I no longer believed in the show or that I no longer cared about the show. It's more that I was doing Mass, and Mass was based around what I felt was the grounding of the show. Like, it was sort of an exaggeration of the more adult grounding that I perceived, and as the seasons dragged on, all that grounding kind of evaporated for me, and I lost my ability to believe anything that was being said. The show lost its believability to me, and I felt like I couldn't really write about the show's believability anymore if, to me, nothing about the show was believable. There was no grounding. What was the point of Mass? I couldn't make fun of the potential grounding anymore. So bearing that in mind, I abandoned mass out of frustration, but it was frustration with mass. It was frustration with the sense that there was nowhere to go with it. But meanwhile, I'm really excited about the Nepotism Adventure series, and I did a new Pilaf because I watched some old Pilaf episodes and I was reminded about how much I kind of like Pilaf, and I just wanted to do another one because I just like the character. I don't think this Pilaf will do as well as past Pilafs because she was critical of the show, and not only that, but I've noticed that just pony videos have dropped off in viewership across the internet a lot more than back in the glory days, of course. The point is, though, some people think that I'm stuck in pony, and I don't know when I finally just quit doing pony entirely, whether I will be done with stuff on the internet. I mean, like, even if I couldn't afford to keep doing animation work, I feel like I'd probably keep doing it as a hobby and take it seriously and do my best to improve. But I'm not locked into a thing that I hate. Like, I really am enjoying working on the Nepotism Adventure series. I feel like there's places to go with the Nepotism Adventure series. I have a really good sense of what exactly my message is there, and what I think is funny about the whole concept. So, yeah, the excitement is real, the passion is there. It's not like all coming from a point of hatred, but it does come from the perspective of like, well, I just don't believe anything that the show does anymore. I feel like nepotism is kind of a big part of My Little Pony. It's maybe not an intentional message, but it definitely feels present just because of the way that they omit things to make stuff work. And sometimes the only real logical explanation is just that stuff works because the ponies know each other or because the ponies are the main characters. Yeah. The universe wills our main characters to succeed, after all. So yes, I know that this is a long video and not particularly amusing, so it's probably a wasted effort. The people who are mad at me are going to be mad at me. The first big time that I said, like, man, I'm sick of Pony and I'm going away from it, we lost a fair number of patrons. We've recovered since then. I think that NAS restored faith in quite a few people because it looks like it's going to be good. I still have confidence it's going to be great. But I know I lost a couple of people. I lost like 3 patrons after the Pilaf video. That one didn't get nearly as many viewers. But like a lot of people are probably not going to listen to this. They really aren't going to care about, my perspective. And I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people who are just going to say like, well, you're wrong. Where Rainbow Dash is in life is one of the most important things, because even though one day the show will end and it's all fiction and it will just fade into the mist of time, it matters. It's like, it's historical importance then, I don't know. Like I say, it doesn't matter where the characters wind up. All that matters is whether or not there's a convincing story to tell as far as I'm concerned. And, to me, there just isn't anymore. So I suppose that's it. It's kind of as much as I wanted to say. I know I've talked about a lot of this stuff in parts in different areas, but this is just, here's a video with pretty much a lot of stuff in it from my perspective, and it's all I can offer. So thanks for listening, those of you guys who got this far. I suppose this will be it. You guys have a great day, and I hope you're looking forward to things. I hope you're excited about the Nepotism Adventure series. I'm probably also going to do another peel-off on the reviews of the movie, and to the chagrin of people who are frustrated with me, the bad reviews of the movie. I thought some of them were really funny, and I could do some comedy with it. But yes, look forward to that. I believe me, if you can have a sense of humor about it, it'll be pretty amusing. So anyway, I'll catch you guys next time. You have a great day.